Point number one this morning is the gospel of Jesus for Paul. Why does Paul need to say that he's not ashamed of the gospel? Well, because at one point in Paul's life, he was ashamed of the gospel. He was not just ashamed, but he feared the good news of Jesus. He was so angered by the good news of Jesus. His name was Saul at the time, and he went around Palestine murdering Christians. So Saul, before he was Paul, went around. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He did not like the good news of Jesus, and he didn't like it so much, he just said, I'm going to murder anybody who loves Jesus, who talks about Jesus, and he went around and did that. Now, you can imagine that Jesus took care of that, because obviously Paul writes Romans. And how does Jesus take care of that? But Saul is walking on a road to Damascus, and Jesus comes and says to Paul, or to Saul at the time, what are you doing? Why are you persecuting me? And Saul is totally floored by the glory of God, and Jesus blinds Paul. And then Jesus he finds two other of his followers and invites them to go heal Saul. And they come, and they're a little scared, but then Jesus is like, trust me. So the guys come, and then they heal Saul, and his eyes, the scales fall from Saul's eyes, and he gets a new name of Paul, and he gets converted. He actually believes the good news of Jesus Christ. Instead of responding in a way that's very negative in killing anybody who loves Jesus, he responds in a way of submitting his life to Jesus. He has his life transformed. What was it like when you came to Jesus? What was it like when you first heard the gospel? How did you first respond when somebody told you about Jesus and what he has done? How long did it take for you to respond? When I think about when I first heard the gospel, I grew up going to church every Sunday, this great Presbyterian church, Emmanuel Presbyterian in Bothell, Washington. And I remember going to Sunday school. I heard the gospel over and over and over again, and my response was negative every single time. I remember growing up, I would be in kids' church, and I would be so disobedient. They'd kick me out of kids' church and put me in the main service. Like, man, I was just a little sinner, and I responded poorly to the gospel, not favorably, all the way until I got to junior high, when there was a moment when I heard the gospel, and I responded. Actually, no, it was sophomore year of high school, so no, it wasn't junior high. I remember my junior high years got pretty bad in me responding negatively to the gospel, until finally I went to a Young Life Club and heard the gospel and finally responded favorably. What was it like for you to respond to the gospel? That's point number one. Again, Paul heard the gospel and it changed his life, but it didn't change his life right away. He had a season where he was ashamed of the gospel. So here in Romans chapter 1, he's saying he is not ashamed of the gospel. And he writes the book of Romans to present us this gospel that he is not ashamed of. Now, he also writes the book of Romans. There's an interesting point in this text where he says, the gospel is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also for the Greek. Now, why does he separate out Jews and Greeks, or Jews and Gentiles? The reason why Paul does that is at this time when the letter was written, Jews who had gotten kicked out of Rome were coming back. So Jewish Christians were kicked out of Rome. And then there was I can't remember exactly how many years, but there was years went by, and then the Jews were allowed back in Rome. So you had a whole group of Gentile Christians who were worshiping in the synagogue, who learned how to do life together around Jesus, that now had a whole group of people coming in who were Jewish Christians, and now they were going to need to do life together. And so Paul is saying the gospel is for all of those groups. The gospel comes in and ministers to all types of groups, ministers to Bears fans and Packers fans. I know Packers fans, it's hard to believe that Jesus is so gracious that he loves Chicago Bears fans, but it's true. That's how gracious he is. I think of the same thing as I'm a Seahawks fan, and I think, man, Jesus is so much more gracious than me because he loves 49ers fans as well. So Paul's writing Romans to bring these two groups together and present the gospel very clearly to them. And that's where we've been over the past 17 weeks, talking about talking through Romans chapters 1 through 8. If you want to see those sermons, experience them, you can go to our website, journeymadison.com, and you can see any of those sermons. So, what is the gospel? How do we describe the gospel? Again, you don't always have 5 minutes. You are definitely like me. I'm not as good as the guys at the Bible Project. So, how can we break the gospel down into something that's really simple? That's something we could put, hold in our hands and then give to somebody else. Give them this good news. So, I wanted to give us 2 really practical ways that we can proclaim the gospel forth. And right now, as our state is opening up, as our country is opening back up, as people are getting out, we're going to be interacting with a lot of people who need hope. And so I think this message is timely for us because I think all of us need a reminder of just how easy it is to proclaim the good news, to tell people about Jesus.